In the early morning hours on Saturday, this was the first indication Vladimir Putin was facing the greatest challenge to his 23-year rule in Russia. Mercenaries from the Wagner private army appeared on the streets of Rostov-on-Don, a city of 1 million and a crucial command center for the war in Ukraine. They faced no resistance. The hostile rhetoric between Russia's military leaders and Wagner's chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, had boiled over.
Earlier in June, Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, issued an edict and basically said that all Wagner troops have to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense, which would effectively remove them from Prigozhin's command. Those who watch this area closely have been sensing that some sort of showdown was going to happen imminently.
Russia experts like Zoya Sheftalovich have watched Prigozhin's rise from prison to a catering fortune to directing a private army leading the fight in Ukraine.
Who he really is a brawler. He has a history of criminal activity. He spent about a decade in prison. He emerged from prison in the wild west of Russia in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union and took advantage of various connections that he had to work his way up into Putin's close circle.
Within hours, the Wagner leader appeared, demanding the capture of Russia's top general and the Minister of Defense, and warning of a move on Moscow. It soon became apparent that was no idle threat.
He's accused the Russian military leadership of botching the invasion, of essentially invading Ukraine on false pretenses, and he's never directly criticized Putin himself and said that he himself was at fault. But this weekend on Saturday, he really came very close to that by saying that Putin had been effectively bamboozled by those around him into launching this invasion.
Social media videos showed a military transport plane shot down by Wagner forces and other fighting. But Wagner's troops moved incredibly quickly. By Saturday afternoon, its forces had reached Voronezh, halfway to Moscow. By Saturday night, units were reported to be just 200 kilometers from the capital. Aside from city trucks blocking roads, it seemed there was very little to stop the Wagner advance.
What he was essentially doing was a game of chicken, because it would have forced, if his troops did get closer to Moscow, if they were nearing something like Red Square, Putin would have been forced to effectively order Russians to fire on Russians.
For several hours, it seemed a coup was possible, and Russia's turbulent history was repeating.
I never thought I'm going to witness something like that again, and here we go. As someone who witnessed, as a grown-up and as a professional, 1991 anti-Gorbachev coup in Moscow. Then 2 years later, in 1993, a bloody standoff between Yeltsin and the rebellious Supreme Soviets, the then parliament of Russia, which resulted in a major shootout in central Moscow with the use of tanks.
Finally, Vladimir Putin appeared on the nation's television screens. He denounced the mutiny as treason and vowed harsh punishment. Yevgeny Prigozhin's forces were 200 kilometers from the Kremlin, and it didn't look like there was any way to stop them. How damaging is that for Vladimir Putin?
I'm certain that this showed to the country, and especially to this vast bureaucracy that Putin's been controlling for 20 plus years, that he is weak, he is indecisive, he is basically so weak that he has to resort to mediators to talk to bandits, to criminals.
By Sunday morning, there was news of a deal brokered by Belarus's dictator, Alexander Lukashenko. Yevgeny Prigozhin's forces turned around. He will have amnesty in Belarus and left Rostov-on-Don to a hero's goodbye. His troops have returned to their barracks. Konstantin Eggert is not alone in suggesting this is hardly the end of the story.
Going to Belarus for anyone is ridiculous. To all extent, to all intents and purposes, it is a Russian colony. So Putin can do anything there. And if he wants to send a thermos full of of poison tea and force Prigozhin to drink it, I think he has a chance. So I suppose that this is just a very, very provisional solution, very temporary.
The fact that this deal was struck by Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian dictator whose regime Putin himself has been propping up for the last 3 years after fraudulent elections, it's a humiliation for Putin, a further humiliation than that he was already dealt on Saturday.
Of the many questions in the aftermath, the key one is how this will impact the war in Ukraine. Zoya Sheftalovich says that may depend on what happens now to Wagner's mercenaries.
The fact is they are the most brutal arm probably of the Russian military. They're sustaining huge casualties. They're kind of the meat in that famous Russian meat grinder where, going back centuries effectively, the way the Russians win wars or fight wars is by throwing more and more humans into the milieu, and other countries such as Ukraine can't afford to lose as many human beings as Russia seems to be able to afford. And so that's really where Wagner has come in.
For now, Vladimir Putin remains. Konstantin Eggert says he's got a long memory, and those who fled on the weekend may pay the price.
I think that Putin, if he stays for long enough, will be trying to find out who was who in this crucial few hours. And I'm sure that he will try and make some heads roll, because his only salvation now is actually in being brutal towards those he suspects of treason.